when two security guards tried to stop a 72-year-old veteran from entering Montana's most exclusive horse auction. They had no idea they were about to face 6 Navy SEALs who would turn their world upside down in a matter of minutes. Albert Ward didn't look like he belonged at the Mountain View Valley Premium Horse Auction House with his faded jeans and old pickup truck, but he'd driven 8 hours through the mountains for one reason: to get back Lightning, the wild Mustang stallion he and his late wife had rescued years ago before bureaucratic red tape seized the horse and put him up for auction. What security guards Bruce Griffin and Caleb Stone couldn't have imagined was that Albert wasn't just some old man trying to cause trouble. He was a decorated Vietnam War veteran and former Navy SEAL whose brothers-in-arms had never forgotten the debt they owed him, and they were all about to walk through those auction house doors to prove that some bonds forged in combat are stronger than any uniform or badge. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel parking lot of the Mountain View Valley Premium Horse Auction House as Albert Ward pulled his weathered 1995 Ford pickup between 2 gleaming Mercedes SUVs. The contrast was stark and intentional. Albert had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to measure a man's character was to see how he treated someone he thought couldn't help him. Albert stepped out slowly, his joints protesting the 8-hour drive from his small ranch in the northern part of the state. His boots crunched on the gravel as he surveyed the impressive facility before him. The auction house was built from native Montana stone and timber, designed to look rustic but clearly expensive. Large windows reflected the mountain peaks in the distance, and a wrought iron sign announced the establishment in elegant script. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. The image showed a magnificent black stallion with a white blaze down his face, standing in a meadow with snow-capped mountains in the background. Lightning. Albert's throat tightened as he looked at the picture, remembering the day his wife, Helen, had taken it. "You ready for this, old friend?" Albert whispered to the photograph before tucking it back into his pocket. The parking lot was filled with the kind of vehicles that screamed money. Horse trailers that cost more than most people's houses, luxury trucks with custom paint jobs, and SUVs with dealer plates from exclusive dealerships in Billings and Bozeman. Albert's truck, with its faded blue paint and small dent in the tailgate, looked like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Albert had dressed in his best clothes for the occasion. His jeans were clean and pressed, his flannel shirt was his newest one, and his boots were polished to a respectable shine. He wore a simple black baseball cap with no logos or writing, and his only jewelry was a plain gold wedding band that he'd never removed, despite Helen being gone for 3 years. Now, as he walked toward the entrance, Albert noticed other auction attendees arriving. A woman in designer riding boots stepped out of a Range Rover, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the early hour. A man in an expensive cowboy hat emerged from a truck that probably cost more than Albert's entire ranch. These were the kind of people who bought horses the way others bought groceries, with casual indifference to the price tags. The auction house entrance was impressive, with heavy wooden doors and brass hardware that gleamed in the morning light. A banner stretched across the front announcing Spring Premium Wild Horse Auction today only. Albert's jaw clenched slightly at the word premium. To these people, Lightning was just another commodity, another status symbol to add to their collections. Albert approached the entrance with the measured pace of a man who had learned patience through decades of hard experience. His posture was straight but not rigid, alert but not tense. Years of military training had taught him to assess his surroundings without appearing to do so, and he could already tell this wasn't going to be simple. 2 security guards flanked the entrance, both wearing black polo shirts with Griffin Security Services embroidered on the chest. The older one was Bruce Griffin, a thick-set man in his mid-40s, with arms crossed and a permanent scowl. His younger partner, Caleb Stone, was tall and lean, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was new to the job. Bruce Griffin had been working security for high-end events in Montana for 15 years, and he prided himself on being able to spot trouble before it started. In his experience, people who didn't belong usually advertised the fact through their appearance, behavior, or attitude. The old man, approaching in the faded jeans and beat-up truck, definitely didn't belong. "Good morning," Albert said politely as he reached the entrance. Bruce looked Albert up and down, taking in the worn clothing and weathered appearance. His expression didn't change, but his body language shifted slightly, becoming more assertive. "Morning," Bruce replied curtly. "You here for the auction?" "I am." "You registered?" Albert reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Right here." Bruce took the registration form and examined it with exaggerated care, as if expecting to find something wrong. Caleb watched nervously, unsure of the protocol, but following his partner's lead. "Albert Ward," Bruce read aloud. "Says here you're interested in Lot 17. That's right. Lot 17 is a premium Mustang stallion. Starting bid is $50,000. Albert's expression didn't change. "I'm aware of that." Bruce handed the form back, but his demeanor suggested the conversation wasn't over. "Look, Mr. Ward, this is a pretty exclusive event. Most of our bidders are serious collectors, people who've been in the horse business for decades. The insurance requirements alone for Lot 17 are substantial." "I understand. Do you? Because once you walk through those doors, you're committing to participate in a legitimate auction. If you bid on something, you need to be able to pay for it. We've had problems in the past with people who get caught up in the excitement and bid more than they can afford." Albert looked Bruce directly in the eyes. "I said I understand." Caleb shifted uncomfortably beside his partner. He was young enough to still believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but experienced enough to know that questioning Bruce's judgment would cost him his job. "The thing is," Bruce continued, "Lot 17 is expected to go for well over 100,000, maybe closer to 200. That's a lot of money for most people." "It is. So you can see why we need to be careful about who we let participate." Albert's voice remained calm and level. "Are you saying I can't go in?" "I'm saying we need to verify your financial capacity before you participate in bidding on premium lots. My registration was accepted when I submitted it 2 weeks ago." "Things change. We have additional verification procedures for high-value items." Albert glanced at the other auction attendees walking past them into the building without being stopped or questioned. A man in a 10-gallon hat had just walked in carrying a briefcase and hadn't been asked to show so much as an ID. "I notice you're not checking everyone's financial capacity." Bruce's jaw tightened. "We use our professional judgment to determine who needs additional screening. And what exactly does your professional judgment tell you about me?" Caleb cleared his throat softly, a warning that his partner might be pushing too hard. Bruce ignored him. "Look, sir, I'm just trying to save you some embarrassment. This isn't the county fair. These are serious buyers with serious money." Albert stood quietly for a moment, processing the situation. He had encountered this kind of prejudice many times over the years, in various forms and locations. The assumption that his appearance meant he couldn't afford to be there, that his age meant he was confused, that his modest clothing meant he didn't belong among the wealthy elite. "I appreciate your concern," Albert said finally, "but I'd like to go inside now. I'm afraid I can't allow that without proper verification." "What kind of verification?" "Bank statements, proof of assets, that sort of thing." "I don't carry bank statements with me." "Then perhaps you should come back another time when you're better prepared." Albert looked past the security guards into the auction house lobby. He could see other bidders registering at tables, examining catalogs, and drinking coffee from china cups. The atmosphere was one of quiet wealth and casual authority. These people belonged here, or at least they acted like they did. "Is there someone else I can speak with?" Albert asked. "I'm the head of security for this event. The decision is mine." "Then I'd like to speak with Joyce Watson." Bruce's expression flickered with surprise. "You know Ms. Watson? We've spoken." This was technically true, though their conversation had been brief and conducted entirely through lawyers and bureaucrats. Joyce Watson owned the auction house and had been instrumental in the legal proceedings that had separated Albert from Lightning. She probably didn't remember his name, but she would certainly remember the case. "Ms. Watson is busy preparing for the auction." "I'm sure she is, but I think she'd want to know that you're preventing a registered bidder from entering." Caleb touched his partner's arm gently. "Maybe we should just let him in, Bruce. His registration looks legitimate." Bruce turned on his younger partner with barely controlled irritation. "I make the security decisions here, not you." "I know, but if he's registered, registration doesn't guarantee entry. We have discretionary authority to refuse admission to anyone we consider potentially disruptive." Albert remained silent during this exchange, but his mind was working. The security guards were clearly operating on assumptions rather than actual policy. They saw an old man in modest clothing and assumed he didn't belong. It was discrimination, pure and simple, but proving it would be difficult and time-consuming. "Look," Bruce said, turning back to Albert, "why don't you just head home? There'll be other auctions, other horses. No point in making this more complicated than it needs to be." Albert's hands remained relaxed at his sides, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders squared slightly, his feet planted more firmly, his breathing deepened. These were subtle changes, the kind that wouldn't be noticed by most people, but might be recognized by someone with military training. "I'm not leaving. Sir, I'm trying to be reasonable here, and I'm trying to be patient, but my patience has limits." Bruce stepped closer, using his size to intimidate. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating a fact." "Well, here's another fact. I can have you arrested for trespassing if you don't leave voluntarily." Albert met Bruce's stare without flinching. "On what grounds?" "I'm a registered bidder attempting to enter a public auction. On the grounds that you're being disruptive and refusing to comply with security procedures." "I haven't been disruptive, and I've complied with every reasonable request. Reasonable is my determination to make." The conversation was attracting attention now. Other auction attendees were slowing down as they passed, curious about the confrontation. Some whispered to their companions, others simply stared. The situation was becoming exactly what Bruce had claimed he wanted to avoid, a scene. But Albert Ward had been in worse situations than this, faced down more dangerous men than these two security guards. He had learned long ago that sometimes you had to stand your ground, even when the odds were against you, especially when the odds were against you. What neither Bruce Griffin nor Caleb Stone knew was that Albert Ward had made some phone calls before driving down to Mountain View Valley. He had reached out to some old friends, men he hadn't spoken to in months, but who had never forgotten the bonds forged in the jungles of Vietnam nearly 50 years ago. And those men were about to arrive. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The standoff at the entrance of the Mountain View Valley Premium Horse Auction House had drawn a small crowd of onlookers. Joyce Watson, the auction house owner, emerged from her office after receiving word that there was a disturbance at the front door. She was a well-dressed woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a professional bun and wearing a navy blazer that spoke of quiet authority. Joyce had built her reputation on running smooth, prestigious events. that attracted the wealthiest horse enthusiasts from across the Rocky Mountain region. The last thing she needed was a public confrontation that might reflect poorly on her establishment's reputation. "What seems to be the problem here?" Joyce asked as she approached the group. Bruce Griffin straightened his posture, clearly relieved. "To have his employer's support. Just a security matter, Ms. Watson. This gentleman is insisting on entering without proper verification of his financial capacity." Joyce looked at Albert Ward for the first time, taking in his modest appearance and weathered features. Her expression was neutral but calculating, weighing the potential risks of the situation. "Mr. Ward, is it?" she said, having overheard Bruce mention his name. "That's correct. I understand you're interested in Lot 17. Lightning." "Yes." Joyce's eyebrows rose slightly at his use of the horse's name rather than the lot number. Most bidders referred to the animals by their catalog designations, treating them as investment opportunities rather than individual creatures. "Lightning is a very special horse," she said carefully. "We expect significant interest from collectors." "I'm sure you do. May I ask what draws you to this particular animal?" Albert reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the photograph again, unfolding it slowly. "He's mine." Joyce took the photograph and examined it closely. The image showed the same black stallion with the distinctive white blaze that was featured prominently in her auction catalogue. But this photo was clearly older, taken in a different location, showing the horse in what appeared to be a natural mountain meadow rather than a holding facility. "This is quite old," she observed. 5 years. Taken on my ranch before the government seized him." Joyce's expression shifted as recognition dawned. She had heard about this case during the legal proceedings that had brought Lightning to her auction house. A complicated situation involving estate disputes, federal regulations, and bureaucratic entanglements that had resulted in the horse being declared surplus property and put up for public sale. "You're the rancher from the Clearwater case," she said quietly. "I am." Bruce Griffin looked confused, sensing that the dynamics of the situation had just changed in ways he didn't understand. "Ms. Watson, do you know this man?" "Not personally," Joyce replied, still studying the photograph. "But I'm familiar with his circumstances." She handed the photo back to Albert, her mind racing through the implications. The Clearwater case had been legally complex, but emotionally straightforward. An elderly rancher and his wife had rescued a Mustang from a Bureau of Land Management roundup, nursed him back to health, and formed a deep bond with the animal. When the wife died and the husband became ill, legal complications arose regarding the horse's ownership status, eventually leading to Lightning being seized as federal property. "Mr. Griffin," Joyce said finally, "I believe Mr. Ward's registration is in order." Bruce's face reddened slightly. "Ma'am, I was just following security protocols. Mr. Ward is a legitimate bidder with a valid registration. There's no reason to prevent his entry, but the financial verification is not required for registered bidders unless there's specific cause for concern." Caleb Stone looked relieved, having felt uncomfortable with the confrontation from the beginning. Bruce, however, wasn't ready to back down completely. "Ma'am, with respect, this is a high-end auction. We have a responsibility to ensure that all bidders can fulfill their obligations." Joyce's voice carried a subtle warning. "We also have a responsibility to treat all registered bidders with equal respect, regardless of their appearance." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Bruce realized he had overstepped his authority and possibly exposed the auction house to liability for discriminatory practices. "Of course, Ma'am. I was just being cautious. Caution is good, prejudice is not." Albert had remained silent during this exchange, allowing Joyce to handle her employee without interference. He appreciated her directness and the way she had taken control of the situation without making it more dramatic than necessary. "Mr. Ward," Joyce said, turning back to him, "I apologize for any inconvenience. You're welcome to enter and participate in today's auction." "Thank you. However," she continued, "I should mention that Lightning has generated considerable interest. We expect the bidding to be quite competitive." "I understand. The starting bid is 50,000, but our pre-auction estimates suggest the final price could exceed 200,000. Albert nodded calmly. "Money isn't the issue." Joyce studied his face, trying to read the man behind the modest exterior. There was something in his eyes that suggested depth she hadn't expected, a quiet strength that seemed at odds with his humble appearance. "Very well, please enjoy the preview and catalogue review. The auction begins at noon." As Joyce turned to go back inside, Bruce Griffin made one last attempt to assert his authority. "Sir, I'll still need to ask you to check any bags or personal items before entering." Albert looked down at his empty hands. "I don't have any bags." "Well, I'll need to do a quick security check anyway." Standard procedure. This was clearly not standard procedure, as evidenced by the fact that other attendees had been walking past without being searched. But Albert simply raised his arms slightly, allowing Bruce to conduct a perfunctory pat-down that revealed nothing more threatening than a wallet, keys, and the folded photograph. "He's clean," Bruce announced, as if he had expected to find weapons or contraband. Albert lowered his arms and looked Bruce directly in the eyes. "I'm not your enemy. I never said you were. Then stop treating me like one." Without waiting for a response, Albert walked past the security guards and through the heavy wooden doors into the auction house lobby. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior, with polished hardwood floors, Native American artwork on the walls, and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one end of the room. Several dozen people were already inside, examining the auction catalogue and socializing in small groups. The atmosphere was one of refined wealth and casual authority. These were people accustomed to getting what they wanted, when they wanted it, without having to justify their presence or prove their worth to security guards. Albert approached the registration table where a young woman with a bright smile was checking in bidders and distributing catalogue materials. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "Name, please?" "Albert Ward." She flipped through a stack of registration forms until she found his paperwork. "Here we are. You're bidding on lot 17, is that correct?" "Yes." "Wonderful. Here's your bidder. Number and catalogue. The horse preview is in the back paddock if you'd like to see Lightning before the auction begins." Albert's heart jumped slightly at the mention of seeing Lightning. He had been hoping for this opportunity, but wasn't sure it would be allowed. "I would, thank you. Just follow the signs through the back door. The preview runs until 11:30. Albert took his materials and made his way through the crowd toward the back of the building. He noticed that several people were staring at him, clearly curious about the commotion at the entrance. Word traveled fast in small communities, and Mountain View Valley was no exception. The back door led to a series of paddocks and holding areas where the auction horses were being kept. The facility was first class, with clean concrete floors, adequate lighting, and proper ventilation. Whatever else might be said about Joyce Watson, she ran a professional operation. Albert followed the signs to paddock 17 and stopped abruptly when he saw Lightning for the first time in 3 years. The stallion was magnificent, even more beautiful than Albert remembered. His black coat gleamed in the morning sunlight, and the distinctive white blaze down his face seemed to glow against the dark fur. Lightning stood about 16 hands high, with the lean build and alert posture characteristic of wild Mustangs. But Albert could see the changes that captivity had wrought. Lightning's eyes, once bright with intelligence and curiosity, now held a wariness that spoke of trauma and uncertainty. His ears moved constantly, alert for threats that might come from any direction. This was no longer the confident, trusting horse that had once followed Albert around his ranch like a giant dog. He's something special, isn't he? Albert turned to find a man in his 60s approaching the paddock. He was well dressed in the expensive casual style favored by wealthy ranchers, with a silver belt buckle and custom-made boots that probably cost more than Albert's truck. Yes, he is. I'm Ben Crawford from over near Bozeman. You interested in this one? I am. Competition's going to be fierce. I've been tracking this horse since the BLM listing came out. Don't see many Mustangs with his bloodlines and training. Albert looked at Crawford more carefully. The man clearly knew something about horses, which made him a serious potential rival for Lightning's affections and ownership. You know his history? Some of it. Rescued from a roundup, trained by some rancher who got in over his head with the federal regulations. Sad story, really. Horse like this deserves better than being shuffled around by bureaucrats. Albert bit back his initial response, which would have been to educate Crawford about exactly who had trained Lightning and why the horse meant more than just another acquisition for a collection. Any idea what he'll go for? My guess? 200? Maybe 250 if the bidding gets emotional. I'm prepared to go to 300 if necessary. Albert absorbed this information without visible reaction. $300,000 was more money than he had readily available, but it wasn't impossible if he was willing to mortgage everything he owned. That's serious money, serious horse. I've got buyers in Texas who would pay $400 for the right animal. This could be that animal. The casual way Crawford discussed the potential resale of Lightning made Albert's jaw clench slightly. To this man, Lightning was just another commodity, another business opportunity. The horse's individual personality, his history, his emotional needs, none of that mattered compared to the profit potential. Well, Albert said carefully, may the best man win. Crawford chuckled. Oh, I intend to. Been in this business for 30 years, son. I know what it takes to get what I want. Albert looked back at Lightning, who had moved closer to the fence and was now watching the two men with intelligent eyes. For just a moment, Albert thought he saw a flicker of recognition in the horse's expression, but it passed so quickly he might have imagined it. "Excuse me," Albert said to Crawford, and walked closer to the fence. Lightning approached cautiously, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air for familiar scents. Albert extended his hand slowly, palm up, in the universal gesture of peace that he had taught Lightning years ago. The stallion stopped just out of reach, clearly torn between wariness and curiosity. His ears swiveled forward and back, processing conflicting signals from his memory and his current circumstances. Albert began to whistle softly, a simple melody that he had often used to calm Lightning during their early training sessions. It was an old folk tune that Helen had hummed while working in her garden, and Albert had adopted it as their special signal. Lightning's ears snapped forward at the sound, and his posture changed subtly. He took one tentative step closer, then another. Crawford watched with professional interest, clearly impressed by the horse's response to Albert's approach. "You've got a way with horses," Crawford observed. "Some of them." Lightning was now close enough that Albert could see the small scar on his right shoulder where he had been injured during his initial capture by the BLM. It was a reminder of the trauma that had brought them together originally. When Albert and Helen had volunteered to help rehabilitate horses that had been injured during the chaotic roundup process, the stallion stretched his neck forward, still cautious, but clearly drawn by something familiar in Albert's presence. Their faces were now only inches apart, separated by the metal fence that kept them from the reunion Albert had dreamed about for 3 years. Then Lightning caught Albert's scent fully, and everything changed. Lightning's recognition was immediate and overwhelming. The stallion whinnied softly, a sound that Albert hadn't heard in 3 years but remembered as clearly as his own heartbeat. The horse pressed his muzzle against the fence, straining to reach the man who had once meant safety. And home. Albert's composure finally cracked. Tears he had been holding back for months rolled down his weathered cheeks as he placed his hand against Lightning's face through the metal bars. The horse nuzzled his palm, breathing in his scent like a drowning man gasping for air. "I know, boy," Albert whispered. "I know. I'm here now." Ben Crawford watched this reunion with growing understanding. "You two know each other." Albert wiped his eyes with his free hand, not ashamed of the emotion, but needing to regain his composure. "We do. This is your horse. Was. For 4 years, before the government took him." Crawford's expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching respect. "The Clearwater case. You're that rancher." "I am. Jesus. I'm sorry, man. I had no idea." Albert looked at Crawford with new eyes, recognizing genuine sympathy rather than the calculating opportunism he had expected. "It's all right. You couldn't have known. Hell of a thing, what they did to you. My lawyer told me about the case when I was researching Lightning's background, said it was one of the worst examples of bureaucratic overreach he'd ever seen." Lightning continued to press against the fence, clearly agitated by the separation. His breathing was rapid and his eyes were bright with an emotion that horses rarely displayed so clearly: hope. "What happened exactly?" Crawford asked. "I mean, if you don't mind talking about it." Albert was quiet for a moment, organizing memories that were still painful to revisit. When Helen died, everything in his world had shifted, including his ability to navigate the complex legal requirements that governed wild horse ownership. My wife Helen passed 3 years ago. Cancer. She was the one who handled all the paperwork, all the government compliance stuff. I was too torn up to deal with it properly after she died. Crawford nodded sympathetically. He had lost his own wife 5 years earlier and understood the disorientation that followed such a loss. The Bureau of Land Management requires annual renewals for wild horse adoption permits. Helen always filed them in February, right after tax season. When she died in January, I forgot. Everything else seemed so unimportant. One missed deadline? That's all it took. By the time I realized what had happened and tried to file the renewal, they said I was in violation of federal regulations. Unauthorized possession of government property. Crawford shook his head in disgust. Bureaucrats, no common sense whatsoever. I hired a lawyer, filed appeals, tried to work through the system, but Lightning had already been seized and classified as surplus property. Once that happens, the only way to get him back is through public auction, which is why you're here, which is why I'm here. Lightning had been listening to their conversation with the focused attention that horses sometimes display when humans are discussing them. He seemed to sense that something important was being decided, something that would affect his future. "I'll tell you what," Crawford said suddenly. "I'm withdrawing my bid." Albert looked at him in surprise. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. I've got plenty of horses, and I can find others. But this one belongs with you." "I appreciate the gesture, but there will be other bidders. Not like me. Most of the other serious money here today is looking at different lots. I was Lightning's main competition." Albert felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who was showing unexpected decency in a situation where he had every right to pursue his own interests. "That's very generous. It's the right thing to do. Besides, I'd rather see a horse go back to someone who loves him than someone who just sees dollar signs." Lightning suddenly lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the building. His body. Language shifted from relaxed to alert, the way horses respond when they sense something their human companions have missed. "What is it, boy?" Albert asked, following the horse's gaze. Through the windows of the auction house, Albert could see increased activity in the lobby. People were moving around more purposefully, and there seemed to be some kind of commotion near the front entrance. Probably just more bidders arriving, Crawford suggested. It's getting close to auction time. But Lightning's reaction suggested something more significant. The horse was now fully alert, his head high and his nostrils flared. This was the posture Albert recognized from their days on the ranch, when Lightning would detect the approach of unfamiliar vehicles long before Albert's human senses could pick them up. "I should get back inside," Albert said reluctantly, giving Lightning one final pat. "See you soon, boy." The horse whinnied again as Albert walked away, a sound that conveyed both longing and trust. It was the sound of an animal who had learned to hope again. As Albert and Crawford walked back toward the building, Crawford continued their conversation. "You know, I might be able to help in other ways. I've got connections in the horse community, people who owe me favors. If the bidding gets out of hand, I could make some calls." "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering." They reached the back door of the auction house, and Albert paused before entering. Through the glass, he could see that the crowd had grown significantly larger, but there was also a different quality to the energy inside. People seemed to be clustering in small groups, talking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward the front entrance. "Something's happening," Albert observed. Crawford peered through the window. "You're right. Looks like there's some kind of situation up front." Albert's military instincts, dormant for decades but never fully extinguished, began to stir. The body language of the people inside suggested tension, uncertainty, the kind of collective unease that occurred when an unexpected element entered a controlled environment. "Maybe we should see what's going on," Crawford suggested. Albert pushed open the door and stepped inside, immediately sensing the change in atmosphere. The polite chatter had become more animated, with an undercurrent of curiosity and mild anxiety. People were definitely focused on something happening near the front of the building. Joyce Watson emerged from a side office, looking concerned and slightly flustered. She was speaking quietly with Harold Peterson, the head auctioneer, and their body language suggested they were dealing with an unexpected situation. Albert approached the registration table, where the young woman who had checked him in earlier was now fielding questions from confused bidders. "Excuse me," Albert said quietly. "Is everything all right?" She looked up with a strained smile. "Oh, hello, Mr. Ward. Yes, everything's fine. Just some additional security procedures we need to implement." "Additional security. Some new arrivals that need to be processed. Nothing to worry about," but her tone suggested there was definitely something to worry about. Albert looked toward the front entrance and could see Bruce Griffin and Caleb Stone standing with several other men. The security guards appeared to be having an animated discussion with the newcomers, though Albert couldn't make out the details from his position. "How many new arrivals?" Albert asked. 6, I think. Maybe 7. They all arrived together. Albert felt a strange sensation in his chest, something between anticipation and recognition. 6 men arriving together at a horse auction was unusual, especially if their presence was causing enough of a stir to disrupt the normal proceedings. Crawford appeared beside him, having overheard the conversation. 6 guys showing up together at a horse auction? That's odd. Maybe they're from the same ranch, the registration clerk suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Albert moved closer to the front of the building, weaving through the crowd of bidders who were all trying to get a better view of whatever was happening at the entrance. As he got closer, he began to pick up fragments of conversation from the security checkpoint. "Need to see identification from all of you. Told you, we're here for the auction. Following standard procedures. Just let us through, son." That last voice made Albert's breath catch. It was deeper than the others, with a slight rasp that suggested years of hard living and harder choices. It was a voice he hadn't heard in person for nearly 2 years, but one he would recognize anywhere. Albert pushed through the crowd until he had a clear view of the front entrance. What he saw confirmed his suspicions and sent a jolt of emotion through his system that was equal parts joy and apprehension. 6 men stood facing Bruce Griffin and Caleb Stone, and Albert knew every one of them. They were older now, grayer and more weathered than when he had last seen them, but their bearing was unmistakable. They stood with the relaxed alertness of professional soldiers, men who had learned to be ready for anything while appearing casual and unthreatening. Dr. Frank Bailey stood slightly ahead of the group, his medical training evident in the way he carried himself with quiet authority. Walter Hughes was to his left, still lean and predatory despite his 70 years. Eugene Duncan's massive frame dominated the right side of the group, while Philip Curtis examined the auction house interior with the calculating gaze of a communications specialist. Harold Harper and Vernon Holland completed the group, positioned slightly behind the others, in a formation that appeared casual but would allow them to respond quickly to any threat or challenge. These were Albert's brothers from Vietnam, the men who had served with him in some of the most dangerous missions of the war. They were the survivors of operations that had never been officially acknowledged, battles that existed only in classified files, and the memories of the men who had fought them. And they were here for him. Albert hadn't seen most of them since Helen's funeral, when they had all gathered to honor the woman who had welcomed them into her home and treated them like family. They had stayed in touch sporadically over the years, Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, but the bonds forged in combat had never weakened. He had made one phone call 3 days ago, a brief conversation with Frank Bailey in which he had mentioned the auction and his concerns about being able to afford Lightning's purchase price. He hadn't asked for help, hadn't suggested that anyone should drop their lives and drive to Montana to support him. But apparently, he hadn't needed to ask. Bruce Griffin was clearly out of his depth dealing with 6 men who radiated the kind of quiet competence that suggested they were accustomed to much more serious situations than a horse auction security checkpoint. "Gentlemen," Bruce was saying, "I understand you want to participate in today's auction, but I need to verify your registrations and financial capacity." Dr. Bailey stepped forward slightly, his voice calm and reasonable. "Son, we're registered, bidders with legitimate business here. I suggest you check your list and let us proceed." "I don't see registrations for 6 people arriving together." "That's because we didn't arrive together," Walter Hughes said quietly. "We just happened to meet in the parking lot." This was technically true, though Albert suspected they had coordinated their arrival times to create exactly this impression. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had kept them all alive in Vietnam and apparently hadn't dimmed with age. Bruce looked back and forth between the 6 men, clearly sensing that he was dealing with something beyond his experience. These weren't wealthy horse collectors or curious locals. These were men who had seen things and done things that put horse auction security into a very different perspective. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor," Bruce announced. "You do that," Dr. Bailey replied pleasantly. "We'll wait." Albert realized he was grinning for the first time in months. His brothers had come, just like he should have known they would. The auction was about to become much more interesting than anyone had anticipated. Albert made his way through the crowded lobby toward the front entrance, his heart pounding with emotions he hadn't felt in years. As he approached the group of 6 men, Dr. Frank Bailey spotted him first and broke into a weathered grin that transformed his serious face. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Frank called out, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of old friendship. The other 5 men turned in unison, their faces lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing their former team leader. Walter Hughes stepped forward first, extending a calloused hand that Albert gripped firmly. Steel Walter said, using Albert's old military nickname. "You're looking good for an old-timer." "Ghost," Albert replied, using Walter's call sign in a return. "What the hell are you all doing here?" Eugene Duncan's massive frame loomed over them as he joined the reunion. "Tank duty," he rumbled, his voice still carrying the authority that had made him the team's demolitions expert. "Someone mentioned you might need backup." Albert looked around at all 6 faces, seeing decades of hard living etched into features he remembered as young and eager. These men had scattered across the country after Vietnam, building families and careers, but the bonds forged in combat had brought them back together when one of their own needed support. "I didn't ask anyone to come," Albert said quietly. "You didn't need to," Philip Curtis replied, adjusting his glasses with the precise movements Albert remembered from countless radio operations. "Phoenix networks still function, even after all these years." Harold Harper nodded in agreement. "Razor-sharp intel travels fast when it matters." Vernon Holland completed the circle, his navigator's instinct still evident in the way he positioned himself to maintain visual contact with all exits. Viper quick response steel, just like old times. Bruce Griffin and Caleb Stone stood nearby, clearly confused by the reunion taking place in front of them. The security guards had expected to deal with troublemakers, not witness what appeared to be a military unit reassembling decades after their service ended. "Gentlemen," Bruce interrupted, "I still need to see everyone's documentation." Dr. Bailey turned toward the security guard with the patient expression he had once used on wounded soldiers who didn't want to follow medical orders. "Son, we're all registered bidders with legitimate business here. Perhaps you should check your registration list instead of making assumptions." Bruce consulted his clipboard, running his finger down a list of names. His expression gradually changed from suspicion to surprise as he found each man's registration properly documented. "You're all here for Lot 17? Bruce asked. "Among others," Walter Hughes replied smoothly. "We're horse enthusiasts with diverse interests." This was technically accurate, though Albert suspected his friend's sudden interest in wild Mustangs had more to do with supporting him than acquiring equine investments. The thought that these men had traveled from across the country on short notice filled him with gratitude and something approaching overwhelm. "I can't believe you all came," Albert said. "Believe it," Frank Bailey replied. "Brothers don't abandon brothers, especially when bureaucrats are involved." Eugene Duncan cracked his knuckles, a sound that made both security guards take an unconscious step backward. "We've dealt with worse than government red tape, Steele. This should be interesting." Albert looked around at his teammates, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through impossible missions 50 years ago. They were older now, grayer and slower, but their core essence remained unchanged. These were men who had learned to solve problems through preparation, teamwork, and absolute commitment to protecting their own. "How did you even know about today?" Albert asked. Philip Curtis smiled. "Phoenix still monitors all frequencies, Steele. Word travels fast when it's important." "Doc made some calls after you talked to him," Walter added. "We had a conference call Tuesday night." "Unanimous decision," Harold Harper confirmed. "No debate required." Vernon Holland nodded. "Navigation was simple once we had the destination." Albert felt his throat tighten with emotion. These men had their own lives, their own responsibilities, their own challenges, but when one of their own needed support, they had dropped everything and converged on Montana like they were responding to a military emergency. Joyce Watson appeared beside the group, having noticed the shift in energy and crowd dynamics. She looked at the reunion with professional curiosity, trying to understand what was happening in her normally predictable auction house. "Mr. Ward," she said, "are these friends of yours?" "Yes, Mom. Old military buddies." Joyce's expression became more interested. "All veterans?" "Navy SEALs," Frank Bailey said with quiet pride. "Vietnam era. The way Joyce's demeanor changed was subtle but noticeable. Her posture straightened slightly, and her voice carried a new note of respect. When she spoke again, "Gentlemen, welcome to Mountain View Valley Premium Horse Auction. I'm Joyce Watson, the owner. Is there anything I can do to make your visit more comfortable?" Bruce Griffin looked confused by his employer's sudden shift to deferential hospitality. Minutes earlier, she had been supporting his security concerns. Now she was treating these men like honored guests. "We're fine, ma'am," Albert replied. "Just here to bid on a horse." "Lot 17, Joyce said knowingly. "Lightning." "That's right." Joyce studied the group of 7 men, recognizing something in their bearing that spoke of shared experiences and mutual loyalty. These weren't casual acquaintances who had bumped into each other at an auction. These were men who had fought together, bled together, and trusted each other with their lives. "Mr. Ward," Joyce said carefully, "might I have a word with you privately?" Albert looked at his teammates, who nodded encouragingly. They had accomplished their primary mission simply by arriving and demonstrating their support. Whatever happened next, Albert would face it with the knowledge that his brothers had his back. Joyce led Albert to a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the crowd and the ongoing drama at the security checkpoint. Her expression was thoughtful, as if she was weighing options that went beyond simple business considerations. "Mr. Ward, I want you to know that I've never felt entirely comfortable with the circumstances that brought Lightning to this auction." Albert studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. "What do you mean?" "The Clearwater case was legally straightforward, but morally complicated. You and your wife rescued that horse, trained him, formed a bond with him. Then bureaucratic technicalities tore you apart." That's an accurate summary. I'm in the business of connecting horses with people who will care for them properly. Usually that means wealthy collectors who have the resources to provide excellent care. But sometimes it means reuniting animals with the people who love them. Albert wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but he sensed that Joyce Watson was more complex than her professional exterior suggested. "Lightning has been here for 6 weeks while we prepared for today's auction," Joyce continued. "He's been well cared for, but he's clearly not thriving. Our veterinarian says he's physically healthy, but emotionally withdrawn." Captivity is hard. On wild horses, it's more than that. He's grieving. Animals form attachments just like people do, and losing those connections causes real trauma. Albert thought about Lightning's reaction when he had seen him in the paddock, the way the horse's entire demeanor had changed upon recognizing his scent and voice. "What are you trying to tell me?" Albert asked. Joyce was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with competing considerations. "I'm trying to tell you that the highest bid doesn't always represent the best outcome for the animal. The law requires you to accept the highest bid. The law requires me to conduct a fair and transparent auction. It doesn't specify how I define fairness." Albert looked at her more carefully, beginning to understand that Joyce Watson might be more sympathetic to his situation than he had dared to hope. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I can't ask you to manipulate the auction process." "You're not asking. I'm telling you that I have discretionary authority in certain circumstances." Before Albert could respond, a commotion near the front entrance drew their attention. Bruce Griffin's voice had risen above the normal lobby conversation, and people were beginning to stare. "Sir, I don't care what your registration says. I have authority to refuse entry to anyone I consider potentially disruptive." Albert looked across the room and saw that Bruce was now facing off against Eugene Duncan, whose massive frame made the security guard look like a child confronting a grizzly bear. Tank's expression was patient but determined, the look of a man who had dealt with much more serious obstacles than an officious security guard. "Son," Eugene said in his deep, rumbling voice, "I suggest you step aside before this becomes unpleasant." The The threat was delivered so calmly that it took Bruce a moment to realize he had been threatened. When understanding dawned, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Eugene replied. "There's a difference." Walter Hughes moved up beside his teammate, his sniper's instincts positioning him for maximum tactical advantage. "Tank's right, Bruce. This doesn't need to get complicated." "Ghost protocols are simple," Philip Curtis added, his communication skills evident in the way he kept his voice level and reasonable. "We're here to bid on horses, not create problems." Harold Harper and Vernon Holland flanked the group, their positioning casual but strategically sound. "Razor-sharp focus on the mission," Harold observed quietly. "Viper navigation suggests the path of least resistance," Vernon added. Joyce Watson watched this confrontation with growing concern. Her auction house was about to become the site of a standoff between her security guards and a group of Vietnam veterans who clearly had no intention of backing down. "Mr. Griffin," she called out sharply, "stand down immediately." Bruce turned toward his employer, confusion evident on his face. "Ma'am, these men are being disruptive. These men are registered bidders and honored veterans. You will treat them with appropriate respect. But no buts. Let them through immediately." Bruce's face went through several color changes as he realized his authority was being publicly undermined. Caleb Stone looked relieved, having sensed from the beginning that confronting these particular men was a mistake. Albert rejoined his teammates as the security checkpoint drama concluded. The 6 men had accomplished their secondary objective, demonstrating that Albert Ward was not alone, not friendless, and definitely not someone to be dismissed or mistreated. "Everything okay, Steele?" Frank Bailey asked. "Better than okay," Albert replied, looking around at the faces of men who had traveled hundreds of miles to stand with him. "Much better than okay." The auction was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and Lightning's lot was number 17 in a catalogue of 25 horses. Albert now faced the bidding process with resources he hadn't possessed an hour earlier. Not just the moral support of his brothers, but the growing suspicion that Joyce Watson might be an unexpected ally in his quest to bring Lightning home. The auction house lobby had transformed from a polite gathering of horse enthusiasts into something resembling a military staging area. Albert's 6 teammates had dispersed throughout the room with the practiced efficiency of men who understood the importance of strategic positioning. To casual observers, they appeared to be examining auction catalogues and socializing with other bidders, but Albert recognized the defensive perimeter they had established around the central seating area. Harold Peterson, the head auctioneer, emerged from a back office carrying a leather portfolio and surveying the crowd with the experienced eye of a man who had conducted hundreds of high-stakes auctions. He was a distinguished gentleman in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that could control a room full of competitive bidders. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold announced in a voice that carried easily across the lobby, "we'll be beginning today's auction in 15 minutes. Please take your seats and have your bidder numbers ready." The crowd began moving toward the main auction room, a converted barn space with tiered seating that could accommodate about 200 people. Albert followed the flow, noting that his teammates were positioning themselves throughout the seating area rather than clustering together. It was subtle, tactical thinking that would give them maximum coverage of the room and the best ability to monitor potential threats or complications. As Albert found his assigned seat in the 4th row, Ben Crawford appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the refreshment table. "Thought you might need this," Crawford said, offering one of the cups. "Big day ahead." "Thank you," Albert replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I appreciate everything you've done." "Don't mention it. Besides, I'm enjoying the show your friends are putting on." Albert glanced around the room and saw what Crawford meant Dr. Frank Bailey had taken a seat near the auctioneer's podium where he could monitor the proceedings with medical precision. Walter Hughes was positioned along the right wall with clear sightlines to all entrances. Eugene Duncan's massive frame occupied an aisle seat that would allow him to move quickly if necessary. Philip Curtis sat near the back with several other bidders, engaging them in casual conversation while gathering intelligence about their interests and financial capabilities. Harold Harper had positioned himself along the left wall, his attention seemingly focused on the auction catalogue, but actually monitoring the room's dynamics. Vernon Holland occupied a seat near the rear exit, maintaining situational awareness, like the navigator he had once been. "Your buddies know what they're doing," Crawford observed. "They always have." Joyce Watson entered the auction room and took her position at a small table beside the auctioneer's podium. She looked composed and professional, but Albert caught her glancing in his direction with an expression that suggested she was still considering their earlier conversation. Bruce Griffin and Caleb Stone had also entered the room, stationing themselves along the walls in positions that mirrored Albert's teammates. The security guards were clearly aware that the dynamics had shifted, and they were trying to maintain some semblance of control over an event that was no longer entirely under their authority. Harold Peterson stepped to the podium and adjusted his microphone, testing the sound system with a few practice words. The room gradually quieted as bidders settled into their seats and prepared for the proceedings to begin. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Harold began formally. "Welcome to Mountain View Valley Premium Horse Auction's Spring Wild Horse Sale. Today we'll be offering 25 exceptional animals, all properly documented and ready for immediate transfer to their new owners." Albert opened his catalogue to Lot 17 and studied Lightning's listing one more time. The description was accurate but clinical, reducing his magnificent horse to a series of measurements, breeding information, and training notes. There was no mention of Lightning's personality, his intelligence, or the emotional trauma he had endured during his separation from the ranch. "Our first lot today is a beautiful paint mare from the Nevada range," Harold continued. "Lot number 1, starting bid $5,000. The bidding began with the polite efficiency that characterized high-end auctions. And rose and fell. Harold's assistant recorded bid numbers, and the paint mare quickly sold for $12,000 to a woman in the front row who barely looked up from her phone during the process. Albert tried to focus on the early lots, but his attention kept drifting to his teammates and their careful monitoring of the room's occupants. Frank Bailey was taking notes in a small notebook, recording bidder numbers and final prices with the methodical attention he had once applied to medical records. Walter Hughes remained motionless, except for his eyes, which swept the room in. Regular patterns that missed nothing. Lot number 5 sold for $28,000. Lot number 8 went for $45,000 to a man who Albert recognized as another wealthy rancher. The prices were climbing steadily, and Albert began to calculate whether he would have sufficient resources to compete effectively when Lightning's turn arrived. During the sale of lot number 10, Albert noticed that Philip Curtis had engaged several bidders in conversation and was gathering information about their interests. Phoenix's communication skills were as sharp as ever, and Albert suspected his teammate was learning valuable intelligence about who might bid against him for Lightning. Lot number 12, Harold announced, a magnificent chestnut stallion from the Colorado range, starting bid $30,000. The chestnut generated significant interest, with bidding quickly escalating beyond Albert's financial capabilities. When the hammer finally fell at $85,000, Albert felt a knot forming in his stomach. If a Colorado Mustang could command that price, what would Lightning bring? Eugene Duncan caught Albert's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, a signal that Albert interpreted as reassurance. Tank had always been the team's problem solver, the man who found ways through obstacles that seemed insurmountable. If he was projecting confidence, there was probably a reason. Lot number 15, Harold continued. A beautiful black mare with exceptional bloodlines. Starting bid $40,000. The black mare's bidding was fierce, involving at least 6 different participants. Albert watched the process with growing anxiety, noting the casual way wealthy bidders threw around amounts that represented his entire annual income. When the mare sold for $130,000, Albert began to seriously question whether he belonged in this financial stratosphere. Ben Crawford leaned over and whispered, "Don't let the big numbers intimidate you. Every horse is different. Every situation is unique." Albert nodded, appreciating the encouragement, but still feeling overwhelmed by the economic realities he was facing. Even with Crawford's withdrawal from the bidding, he would be competing against people for whom 6-figure expenditures were routine. Lot number 16, Harold announced. A spirited Palomino gelding from the Wyoming range, starting bid $25,000. As the Palomino's bidding proceeded, Albert noticed movement near the back of the room. A man in an expensive suit had entered and was speaking quietly with Joyce Watson. Their conversation appeared intense, and Joyce's expression suggested she was receiving information that concerned her. Walter Hughes had also noticed the newcomer and was tracking his movement with the focused attention of a sniper acquiring a target. When the man approached Joyce's table and handed her what appeared to be official documents, Walter's posture shifted almost imperceptibly into a more alert stance. Philip Curtis was watching the interaction as well, his communications specialist's instincts picking up on the urgency of the whispered conversation. When Joyce's face went pale and she began shuffling through the documents with obvious distress, Phoenix moved closer to get a better view of the situation. The Palomino sold for $62,000, but Albert barely noticed. His attention was fixed on Joyce Watson, who was now speaking urgently with Harold Peterson. The auctioneer's expression became serious as he reviewed the documents, and he glanced in Albert's direction with what might have been sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold announced, "we're going to take a brief intermission before presenting. Lot 17, please feel free to stretch your legs and visit the refreshment table." The unexpected break caused murmurs of confusion throughout the audience. Auction intermissions were unusual, especially when they interrupted the flow of lot presentations. Albert felt his anxiety spike as he wondered what kind of complication had arisen. Joyce Watson stood and made her way through the crowd toward Albert's seat, her expression grave and her posture suggesting she was the bearer of unwelcome news. Behind her, the man in the expensive suit followed at a respectful distance, carrying a briefcase that suggested official business. "Mr. Ward," Joyce said quietly when she reached him, "could I speak with you outside for a moment?" Albert's teammates had noticed the development and were converging on his position with the smooth coordination of a military unit responding to a threat. Frank Bailey arrived first, his medical training evident in the way he assessed Joyce's stress level and Albert's rising anxiety. "Is there a problem?" Frank asked. "I'm not sure yet," Joyce replied honestly. "Mr. Ward, this gentleman is Agent Cooper from the Bureau of Land Management. He has some information about Lot 17 that we need to discuss." Agent Cooper stepped forward, extending his hand to Albert with the practiced politeness of a federal bureaucrat who delivered bad news for a living. He was a thin man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of serious expression that suggested he took his regulatory responsibilities very seriously. "Mr. Ward, I'm Agent Lisa Cooper with the BLM. I understand you have a personal interest in Lot 17. "I do. I'm afraid there's been a development that complicates today's auction." Albert felt his heart sink. After everything he had been through, after his teammates had traveled hundreds of miles to support him, after Joyce Watson had hinted at her willingness to help, some new bureaucratic obstacle was about to destroy his chances of reuniting with Lightning. What kind of development? Albert asked, his voice steady despite his rising panic. Agent Cooper opened his briefcase and retrieved a folder thick with official documents. We've received a legal challenge to the auction of Lot 17. A private party is claiming ownership rights that predate the federal seizure. Who? I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but the claimant has provided documentation that appears to establish a legitimate prior interest in the animal. Eugene Duncan stepped closer, his massive presence making Agent Cooper visibly nervous. What kind of documentation? Sir, this is a federal matter that doesn't concern you. Frank Bailey moved up beside Tank, his medical authority lending weight to his words. Actually, it concerns all of us. We're here to support our friend, and any legal complications that affect him affect us as well. Agent Cooper looked around at the growing circle of stern-faced veterans and realized he was dealing with more than just a disappointed bidder. These men had the bearing and confidence of people who were accustomed to challenging authority and getting results. The documentation includes breeding records, training certificates, and veterinary reports that suggest the animal was never legally available for federal seizure. Albert felt a mixture of hope and confusion. Are you saying Lightning was illegally taken? I'm saying the situation is more complicated than originally understood. The auction of Lot 17 is suspended pending a full legal review. Joyce Watson looked as frustrated as Albert felt. How long will this review take? Could be weeks, could be months. Federal bureaucracy moves slowly, especially when property rights are involved. Walter Hughes spoke for the first time, his sniper's precision evident in his choice of words. Agent Cooper, who filed this legal challenge? I'm not authorized to reveal that information. Harold Harper stepped forward, his security consultant background evident in his analytical approach. The timing is suspicious. Why wait until the day of the auction to file this challenge? I don't make policy, sir. I just enforce it. Vernon Holland completed the circle around Agent Cooper, his navigator's instincts recognizing that they needed more information to chart a course forward. Where is the horse now? Lot 17 remains in federal custody, pending resolution of the ownership dispute. Albert looked around at his teammates, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through impossible situations 50 years ago. Whatever this new obstacle was, whatever legal complication had arisen, they would find a way through it together. But first, they needed to understand exactly what they were up against. The conference room behind Joyce Watson's office had become an impromptu war room. Albert sat at the head of a polished oak table, surrounded by his 6 teammates who had arranged themselves with the instinctive spacing of men accustomed to tactical planning sessions. Agent Cooper occupied a chair at the opposite end, her briefcase open and documents spread across the table like evidence in a criminal investigation. Joyce Watson had provided coffee and closed the door to ensure privacy, then positioned herself where she could observe both the federal agent and the veterans. The auction had been suspended indefinitely, leaving 200 disappointed bidders milling around the lobby while this crisis played out behind closed doors. Agent Cooper, Dr. Frank Bailey began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had interrogated wounded enemy soldiers. You said someone filed a legal challenge. We need specifics. I understand your concern, but federal privacy regulations prevent me from disclosing the identity of private claimants. Walter Hughes leaned forward slightly, his sniper's patience evident in the way he waited for exactly the right moment to speak. The timing suggests this isn't a legitimate ownership dispute. Someone waited until today to disrupt the auction. I can't speculate about motives. Eugene Duncan's massive hands rested on the table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. Can't or won't. Agent Cooper shifted uncomfortably under Tank's direct stare. Won't. This is a federal investigation now, and I'm not authorized to share details with unauthorized parties. Philip Curtis adjusted his glasses with the precise movement Albert remembered from countless radio operations. Agent Cooper, we're not unauthorized parties. We're citizens with legitimate interests in this matter. Your friend's registration to bid doesn't give him special access to confidential federal documents. Harold Harper tapped the table once, with his index finger, a gesture that somehow conveyed both patience and warning. We're not asking for confidential documents. We're asking for basic information about a process that affects our friend's legal rights. Vernon Holland had been studying a map of Montana on his phone, his navigator's instincts automatically tracking potential routes and resources. The challenger would need significant documentation to halt a federal auction, breeding records, training certificates, veterinary reports. That suggests someone with substantial resources and advanced knowledge. Agent Cooper's expression flickered with surprise at Vernon's tactical analysis. I see you gentlemen have given this considerable thought. We're problem solvers, Albert said quietly. It's what we do. Mr. Ward, I sympathize with your situation, but federal law is clear. When ownership disputes arise, property must remain in government custody until resolution. Joyce Watson had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration. Agent Cooper, this horse has been in federal custody for 3 years. If there was a legitimate ownership dispute, why wasn't it raised during the original seizure proceedings? Ma'am, I don't have information about the original case. I'm only dealing with today's challenge. Frank Bailey opened his medical bag and pulled out a small notebook, the same type he had used to record patient information during their Vietnam deployments. Agent Cooper, would you object if we asked some general questions about federal procedures? That depends on the questions. How long does a typical ownership review take? Anywhere from 30 days to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the documentation. Albert felt his heart sink. 18 months meant Lightning could remain in federal custody well into his 70s, assuming he lived that long. The stress of prolonged separation might be more than either of them could survive. What happens to the horse during the review process? Walter asked. The animal remains in BLM custody at an approved facility. Which facility? That's confidential for security reasons. Eugene Duncan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Security reasons? Wild horses are valuable animals. We've had problems with theft and unauthorized removal in the past. Albert looked around the table at his teammates, seeing the same calculation. In their eyes, that had once helped them plan impossible missions behind enemy lines. They were assessing resources, evaluating obstacles, and developing contingencies for scenarios that Agent Cooper probably couldn't imagine. Agent Cooper, Philip Curtis said carefully, is there any circumstance under which the horse could be released to his previous caretaker pending resolution of the dispute? Not without a court order. What would be required to obtain such an order? A federal judge would need to determine that the previous caretaker had superior claim to custody and that maintaining the status quo caused irreparable harm. Harold Harper leaned back in his chair, his security consultant background evident in his methodical approach. That requires legal representation and substantial documentation. It also requires proof that federal custody is harmful to the animal's welfare, Vernon added. Albert had been listening to this discussion with growing understanding of the legal maze he would need to navigate. The system was designed to protect government interests, not individual relationships with animals that had been classified as federal property. There's something else, Joyce Watson said suddenly. Something that might be relevant. Agent Cooper looked at her with renewed interest. What do you mean? Lightning has been exhibiting stress behaviors since arriving at our facility. Our veterinarian documented weight loss, reduced appetite, and what she described as depression symptoms. Animals adapt to new environments given sufficient time. Not this one. Dr. Foster's reports show progressive deterioration over the past 6 weeks. Albert felt a surge of pain at the thought of Lightning suffering in captivity. The horse had always been sensitive to separation from familiar people and places, a trait that had made their original bonding so intense and meaningful. Where are those veterinary reports? Frank Bailey asked, his medical training focusing on the documentation that might provide leverage. Joyce retrieved a file folder from her desk and handed it to Frank. Dr. Foster completed a full examination yesterday in preparation for today's auction. Frank opened the folder and studied the veterinary records with professional intensity. His expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed the data. This horse is in distress, Frank announced. Significant weight loss, elevated stress hormones, behavioral indicators consistent with separation anxiety and depression. Agent Cooper looked uncomfortable. The BLM provides adequate care for all animals in custody. Adequate isn't sufficient for an animal with this level of psychological trauma, Frank continued. These symptoms suggest the horse has formed an attachment to specific individuals and is suffering from forced separation. Walter Hughes had been studying the veterinary reports over Frank's shoulder. The behavioral notes mention repetitive pacing and refusal to interact with handlers. Classic signs of emotional distress in horses, Eugene added, his demolitions expertise extending to an unexpected knowledge of animal psychology. Philip Curtis was taking notes in his own notebook, recording information with the systematic approach he had once applied to intelligence gathering. Agent Cooper, if continued federal custody is demonstrably harmful to the animal's health, doesn't that create liability for the government? I'm not qualified to make medical determinations. But Dr. Foster is qualified, Harold pointed out. And her documentation is clear. Vernon Holland had been studying the legal documents Agent Cooper had brought. The challenger's paperwork would need to be extraordinarily compelling to override 3 years of established custody and documented animal welfare concerns. Agent Cooper gathered her documents with obvious discomfort. Gentlemen, I understand your frustration, but I have procedures to follow. The horse remains in federal custody pending review. What if we could prove the challenge is fraudulent? Albert asked quietly. Agent Cooper paused in her document gathering. That would be a serious allegation. It would also be a federal crime, Walter observed, filing false documents to disrupt government proceedings. If someone could prove fraudulent intent, Philip added, it might expedite the review process. Agent Cooper looked around the table at 7 determined faces, realizing that these men were not going to simply accept bureaucratic obstacles without a fight. Mr. Ward, if you believe the challenge is fraudulent, you can file a counterclaim with supporting documentation. What kind of documentation? Proof of prior ownership, evidence of the relationship between you and the animal, testimony from witnesses who can verify your claims. Albert looked at his teammates, seeing the same spark of possibility in their eyes that had once ignited their most successful operations. We have documentation, Frank Bailey said slowly. Veterinary records from Albert's ranch, training notes, photographs spanning 4 years. We have witnesses, Walter added, people who saw Albert working with Lightning, who can testify to their relationship. We have expertise, Eugene continued, professional credentials that support our assessment of the situation. Philip Curtis was already opening his phone to access contacts that might prove useful. We have resources for investigating the source of this challenge. Harold Harper nodded grimly. We have experience dealing with bureaucratic obstacles. Vernon Holland studied his map again, his navigator's mind already plotting the most efficient course forward. We have the ability to coordinate multiple approaches simultaneously. Agent Cooper looked at Joyce Watson, who had been listening to this exchange with growing recognition that she was witnessing something extraordinary. "Agent Cooper," Joyce said finally, "I think these gentlemen are about to prove that bureaucracy isn't the only system that knows how to operate efficiently." Albert stood slowly, feeling strength and purpose flowing back into his bones for the first time in months. His brothers had come when he needed them, and now they were preparing to do what they had always done best, accomplish the impossible through teamwork, determination, and refusal to accept defeat. "Agent Cooper," Albert said, "you can tell whoever filed this challenge that they picked the wrong fight with the wrong people. We're going to prove it's fraudulent, and we're going to bring Lightning home." The federal agent looked around the room one more time, taking in the quiet confidence and absolute determination radiating from 7 men who had learned long ago that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. "Mr. Ward," she said, "finally, I'll be interested to see what you can accomplish." As Agent Cooper left the conference room, Albert's teammates began the process that had once made them one of the most effective special operations units in Vietnam. They were going to war again, this time against bureaucracy and whoever was trying to keep a man separated from the horse he loved. And this time, they had no intention of losing. 24 hours after the auction's abrupt suspension, Albert's ranch house had transformed into a command center that would have impressed their old commanding officers in Vietnam. Maps covered the kitchen table, laptops hummed on every available surface, and his teammates had established communication links with contacts across the country. Walter Hughes stood at the front window, maintaining watch on the access road with the same vigilance he had once applied to sniper positions in the Mekong Delta. Eugene Duncan worked at the kitchen table, his demolitions expertise now focused on systematically dismantling the legal challenge through careful analysis of every document. "Phoenix has established contact with BLM Records Division in Nevada," Philip Curtis announced from his position at Albert's computer. "They're sending copies of all original seizure documentation from 3 years ago." Frank Bailey looked up from a stack of veterinary records spread across the coffee table. "Doc Foster's medical assessments provide a strong foundation for animal welfare claims. Lightning's deterioration is extensively documented." Harold Harper had commandeered Albert's landline telephone and was working his network of security contacts. Throughout Montana, Razor intelligence indicates the legal challenge was filed by a Denver law firm with connections to wealthy horse collectors. Vernon Holland studied topographical maps on his tablet, his navigator's mind tracking the locations of BLM facilities where Lightning might be held. Viper surveillance has identified 3 possible custody locations within driving distance. Albert moved between his teammates, coordinating their various investigations while trying to process the flood of information they were generating. The systematic approach reminded him of mission planning sessions from 50 years ago, when their survival had depended on gathering intelligence and developing multiple contingency plans. "Tank," Albert said to Eugene, "what have you learned about the challenge's documentation?" Eugene adjusted his reading glasses and consulted his notebook. The breeding records claim Lightning was stolen from a private ranch in Colorado 5 years ago. But the timing doesn't match the BLM roundup schedules. How so? According to federal records, Lightning was captured during a Nevada roundup in April 2019. The challenger claims he was stolen from Colorado in June 2019. Horse can't be in 2 places at once. Walter called from his position at the window. "Vehicle approaching, looks official." Frank Bailey peered through the curtains and identified a white SUV with government plates. "BLM agent, Probably Cooper returning with more bureaucratic complications. Albert opened the front door as Agent Cooper parked and approached the house. She looked tired and somewhat overwhelmed, carrying a briefcase that appeared heavier than the one she had brought to the auction house. "Mr. Ward," she said as she reached the porch, "I have some updates about your situation. Good news or bad news? Both. May I come in?" Albert led Agent Cooper into the living room, where his teammates arranged themselves in positions that provided both support and subtle intimidation. Cooper looked around at the organized chaos of documents and equipment, clearly recognizing a serious investigation in progress. "Gentlemen," she began, "I've reviewed the challenge's documentation more thoroughly since yesterday's meeting." "And?" Frank prompted. "There are discrepancies, significant ones." Eugene looked up from his analysis. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The breeding records show inconsistencies in dating and location information. The veterinary reports contain technical errors that suggest they weren't prepared by qualified professionals." Walter maintained his position by the window, but turned his attention to Cooper. "You're saying the documentation is fraudulent?" "I'm saying it raises questions that require investigation." Philip Curtis swiveled his chair to face the agent. "Have you identified the source of the challenge?" Cooper hesitated, clearly wrestling with federal disclosure regulations versus the mounting evidence of potential fraud. "The law firm that filed the paperwork is legitimate, but they claim their client wishes to remain anonymous. Anonymous clients don't have ownership rights to specific horses," Harold observed. "No, they don't, which is why I've recommended a formal fraud investigation." Albert felt the first surge of genuine hope he had experienced since the auction's suspension. What does that mean for Lightning? If the challenge is determined to be fraudulent, the original auction would be reinstated. How long does a fraud investigation take? Depends on the complexity, but usually much faster than an ownership review. Weeks rather than months. Vernon looked up from his maps. "Where is Lightning being held during this process?" Cooper consulted her notes. "Temporary custody at the Western Montana Wild Horse Sanctuary, about 2 hours north of here." Albert's teammates exchanged glances. The sanctuary was within reasonable driving distance, which opened up possibilities that more distant facilities would not have provided. "Can he have visitors?" Albert asked. "Not officially. Federal custody restrictions prohibit unauthorized contact." Frank Bailey closed his veterinary files and focused on Cooper. "What about medical evaluation? If Lightning's condition continues to deteriorate, someone needs to assess his welfare." "The sanctuary has qualified staff, but they don't know his history, his behavioral patterns, his specific needs," Eugene pointed out. Cooper studied the determined faces around her, recognizing that these men were not going to simply wait for bureaucratic processes to resolve Albert's situation. "Mr. Ward, I'm going to speak off the record for a moment." Albert nodded. "The challenge to your horse's auction appears to be part of a larger pattern. We've had similar last-minute ownership disputes involving other high-value Mustangs over the past year. Someone's systematically disrupting auctions. It appears so. Always anonymous clients, always filed through different law firms, always with questionable documentation." Walter turned from the window, his sniper's instincts focusing on this new intelligence. "Someone's manipulating the system to keep valuable horses in federal custody." "But why?" Philip asked. Harold leaned forward in his chair. "Access. If you can't buy the horses at auction, you find other ways to acquire them." Vernon nodded grimly. "Federal custody facilities have security vulnerabilities that private auctions don't." Cooper looked surprised by their rapid analysis of the situation. "You gentlemen have experience with this kind of systematic fraud. We have experience with people who use legitimate systems to accomplish illegitimate goals," Albert replied. Eugene closed his notebook and looked directly at Cooper. "Agent, what would you need to expedite the fraud investigation?" Evidence that the documentation was deliberately falsified. Proof that the challenger doesn't exist or has no legitimate claim to the horse. Frank Bailey opened his laptop and pulled up a genealogy website. Give me the name on the breeding records. I can trace ownership history for any registered horse in the country. Cooper hesitated again, then opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. The challenger claims to be Rebecca Morrison, owner of Morrison Ranch in Colorado. Philip Curtis was already typing on his computer. Morrison Ranch, Colorado. Let me check business registrations. Frank accessed horse breeding databases while Eugene pulled up Colorado property records on his tablet. Harold began making phone calls to his contacts in the private security industry. Morrison Ranch doesn't exist, Philip announced after 5 minutes of searching. No business registration in Colorado under that name. Rebecca Morrison doesn't exist either, Frank added. No registration records for a horse owner by that name in any western state. Eugene looked up from his property research. No Morrison Ranch in Colorado property tax records. No large horse breeding operations under that name anywhere in the state. Harold finished his phone call and turned to the group. Security contacts in Denver have never heard of Rebecca Morrison or Morrison Ranch. If she was a legitimate horse breeder, someone in the community would know her. Cooper stared at the laptop screens, displaying the results of their investigation. You found all this in 15 minutes? We're motivated, Walter observed dryly. And experienced, Vernon added. Albert looked at Agent Cooper with growing confidence. How long would it take your fraud investigation to reach the same conclusions? Weeks, maybe months. Federal bureaucracy doesn't move this quickly. But you have the authority to act on evidence of fraud? Cooper closed her briefcase slowly, clearly making a decision that would affect her career. Mr. Ward, if I were to recommend immediate reinstatement of the auction based on evidence of fraudulent documentation, it would require my supervisor's approval. How long would that take, with the right evidence presented properly? A few days. Frank Bailey gathered the veterinary records and handed them to Cooper. Agent, Lightning's medical condition is deteriorating rapidly. Every day in federal custody increases the risk of permanent psychological damage. Eugene added his legal analysis to the pile. The fraudulent documentation is provably false. We can provide detailed evidence within hours. Philip opened a new document on his computer. We can prepare a comprehensive report documenting the systematic pattern of auction disruptions. Harold pulled out his phone. We can provide expert witnesses to testify about the fraud investigation. Vernon spread his maps across the table. We can coordinate with sanctuary staff to monitor Lightning's condition during the expedited process. Albert looked around at his teammates, seeing the same determination and efficiency that had once made them legendary among special operations units. They had identified the problem, gathered intelligence, developed solutions, and were prepared to execute a coordinated response. Agent Cooper, Albert said, my brothers and I spent 50 years learning how to solve problems that bureaucracy couldn't handle. We're offering to help you solve this one. Cooper looked at the evidence spread across Albert's living room, then at the 7 men who had assembled it in a fraction of the time her agency would normally require. Mr. Ward, I think your horse is about to benefit from the most efficient fraud investigation in BLM history. Walter Hughes smiled for the first time since arriving in Montana. Ghost operations tend to be thorough. Eugene cracked his knuckles. Tank strategies usually work. Philip saved his document files. Phoenix communications are always reliable. Harold pocketed his phone. Razor analysis cuts through bureaucratic obstacles. Vernon folded his maps. Viper navigation finds the quickest route home. Frank closed his laptop. Doc prescriptions cure government inefficiency. Albert looked out toward the mountains, where Lightning was being held. knowing that his horse would soon be coming home to the ranch where he belonged. The bureaucrats had picked the wrong fight with the wrong men, and they were about to learn what happened when Vietnam veterans decided to accomplish a mission. The Western Montana Wild Horse Sanctuary sat in a valley surrounded by pine forests and granite peaks, its pastures and holding facilities designed to provide temporary care for Mustangs caught between freedom and domestication. Albert drove his pickup truck through the main gate at exactly 9 o'clock Thursday morning, followed by Agent Cooper's government SUV and a caravan of vehicles carrying his 6 teammates. Dr. Amanda Foster, the sanctuary's chief veterinarian, met them in the parking area outside the main office. She was a woman in her late 30s with sun-weathered skin and the confident manner of someone who had spent her career working with large animals under challenging conditions. "Mr. Ward," she said as Albert stepped out of his truck, "I've been expecting you. Agent Cooper called yesterday to arrange this visit. How is Lightning?" Dr. Foster's expression grew serious. "Not well. He's refused food for the past 2 days and shows clear signs of severe depression. I've never seen a horse this emotionally distressed." Frank Bailey approached carrying his medical bag, his physician's training evident in his immediate focus on health concerns. "Dr. Foster, I'm Frank Bailey, retired Navy corpsman. May I review Lightning's medical records?" "Of course. I understand you have extensive experience with animal psychology." "Some. Enough to recognize trauma when I see it." Agent Cooper gathered the group near the sanctuary office entrance, a briefcase containing the fraud evidence they had compiled over the past 3 days. "Ladies and gentlemen, I received authorization from my supervisor this morning to proceed with Lightning's release pending resolution of the fraud investigation." Albert felt his heart jump. "He can come home temporarily. You'll maintain custody while we complete the legal process, but the fraudulent challenge has been officially suspended." Walter Hughes had positioned himself where he could observe the sanctuary's security arrangements. "What about the people behind the fake documentation? FBI is investigating the law firm that filed the paperwork. Preliminary evidence suggests a coordinated scheme involving multiple fraudulent claims across several states." Eugene Duncan studied the facility layout with his demolitions expert's eye for structural details. "How many horses are being held here under similar circumstances?" 12 others, Dr. Foster replied. "All high-value Mustangs with disputed ownership, claims filed in the past year." Philip Curtis opened his laptop to document this information. "Agent Cooper, will those cases be reviewed for fraud as well?" "They're all being investigated now. Your documentation provided the template for identifying the pattern." Harold Harper had been listening to this conversation while monitoring his phone for updates from his security contacts. "The fraud investigation should discourage future attempts to manipulate the auction system." Vernon Holland consulted his GPS device, already planning the most efficient route back to Albert's ranch. "Dr. Foster, what special care instructions do we need for Lightning's transport?" "He's physically healthy but emotionally fragile. The reunion with Mr. Ward should help, but full recovery will take time." Dr. Foster led the group along a gravel path toward the holding pastures where the sanctuary's temporary residents grazed. In large fenced areas, the morning air carried the scent of hay and horses, and Albert could hear the familiar sounds of whinnying and hoofbeats that had once been part of his daily routine. "Lightning is in pasture 7, Dr. Foster explained. As they walked, "We've kept him separated from the other horses because he showed no interest in socializing." "That's not normal for him," Albert said. "He's usually curious about other horses." Isolation behavior is common in animals suffering from separation anxiety. He's withdrawn from everything except basic survival activities. They reached a wooden fence surrounding a 5-acre pasture where a single black horse stood motionless near a water trough. Lightning's magnificent coat still gleamed in the morning sunlight, but his posture spoke of defeat and despair. His head hung low, his ears drooped, and his eyes seemed to focus on nothing. Albert gripped the fence rail, his knuckles white with emotion. Jesus, what have they done to him? Frank Bailey stood beside his friend, his medical training allowing him to recognize the depth of psychological trauma they were witnessing. He's given up hope. This is what happens when intelligent animals lose connection to everything they value. Lightning stood about 50 yards away, apparently unaware of the group at the fence. His breathing was shallow and his movement minimal, as if he was conserving energy for basic survival rather than engaging with his environment. Albert climbed over the fence before anyone could stop him, moving slowly across the pasture with his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. His teammates watched tensely, ready to intervene if the horse reacted negatively to the sudden intrusion. "Lightning," Albert called softly when he was about 20 yards away. "Hey, boy, it's me." The horse's ears twitched slightly, the first sign of awareness he had shown since the group arrived. Lightning lifted his head slowly, as if the effort required tremendous energy. "That's right, buddy. Albert's here." Lightning turned his body toward the familiar voice, his movement careful and uncertain. His eyes focused on Albert for the first time, and something shifted in his posture. Albert began whistling the same folk tune he had used at the auction house, the melody that Helen had hummed in her garden, and that had become their special signal. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Lightning's head snapped up fully alert, his ears forward and his nostrils flaring as he tested the air for confirmation of what his eyes and ears were telling him. He took one tentative step forward, then another, his pace increasing as recognition dawned. "Come on, boy. Come home." Lightning broke into a trot, then a canter, covering the distance between them with the fluid grace that had always characterized his movement. He slowed as he approached Albert, uncertainty warring with hope in his intelligent eyes. Albert extended his hand, palm up, maintaining the patient stillness that had defined their early training sessions. Lightning approached cautiously, stretching, his neck forward to catch Albert's scent. The moment of recognition was unmistakable. Lightning pressed his muzzle into Albert's palm, breathing deeply and trembling with emotion. His entire body seemed to relax as the familiar touch and scent confirmed that his long nightmare was finally ending. Albert placed his other hand on Lightning's neck, feeling the horse's rapid heartbeat gradually slow as stress gave way to relief. "I know, boy. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry they took you away." Lightning nuzzled Albert's shoulder, seeking the physical comfort that had been absent from his life for 3 years. His breathing became deeper and more regular, and his ears moved forward into the alert position that Albert remembered from their best days together. At the fence, Albert's teammates watched the reunion with emotions they rarely allowed themselves to feel. These were men who had learned to suppress sentiment in favor of tactical efficiency, but the bond between Albert and Lightning touched something deeper than their professional training. "That's what we fought for," Walter Hughes said, quietly. "The right for good people to love what they love without interference." Frank Bailey wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Medical opinion, that horse just experienced the most effective therapy available." Eugene Duncan's massive frame shook slightly with suppressed emotion. "Tank assessment. Mission accomplished." Philip Curtis documented the reunion with his camera, recognizing that this moment represented the successful conclusion of their coordinated operation. Phoenix communication, message received and understood. Harold Harper maintained security watch while savoring the victory. Razor analysis, perfect execution of tactical objectives. Vernon Holland checked his route planning one final time. Viper navigation, clear path home. Dr. Foster observed the transformation in Lightning's behavior with professional amazement. "I've never seen such a rapid reversal of depression symptoms. The psychological healing is immediate and dramatic." Agent Cooper watched Albert and Lightning reconnecting in the pasture, recognizing that she was witnessing something that made her bureaucratic struggles worthwhile. "Mr. Ward, your horse is officially released to your custody. All federal charges and ownership disputes have been dismissed." Albert looked up from Lightning's neck, his eyes bright with tears he didn't try to hide. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know how to repay what you've done." "No repayment necessary," Frank called from the fence. "This is what brotherhood means." Lightning had gradually moved closer to Albert until they were standing side by side, the horse's head resting against his shoulder in a gesture of complete trust and contentment. The despair and withdrawal that had characterized his captivity had vanished, replaced by the alert intelligence and emotional connection that had always defined their relationship. "Are you ready to come home, boy?" Lightning lifted his head and looked toward the fence where Albert's teammates waited, as if recognizing that these men were responsible for ending his separation from the person he loved most. He whinnied once, a sound of pure joy that carried across the pasture like a celebration. Albert led Lightning toward the gate, walking slowly to allow the horse to process his freedom and reconnect with movement that wasn't constrained by fear or depression. With each step, Lightning's natural grace returned, his stride becoming longer and more confident. As they reached the fence, Lightning approached each of Albert's teammates in turn, extending his muzzle to catch their scents and acknowledge their role in his rescue. The horse seemed to understand that these men were Albert's brothers and therefore deserving of his respect and gratitude. Dr. Foster prepared the transport trailer while Agent Cooper completed the final paperwork that would officially close Lightning's federal case. The fraud investigation would continue, but Lightning was free to return to the ranch where he belonged. "One more thing," Agent Cooper said as she handed Albert the release documents. "The investigation has identified at least 6 other veterans whose horses were stolen through similar fraudulent challenges. Your case has opened the door for all of them to get their animals back." Albert looked around at his teammates, recognizing that their mission had accomplished more than just Lightning's rescue. They had exposed a systematic fraud that had separated multiple veterans from the animals that provided emotional healing and connection. "Steal," Walter said, using Albert's military call sign one final time. Ready to load up and head home, Albert looked at Lightning, who was now alert and eager, his eyes bright with anticipation of returning to familiar pastures and routines. "We're ready." As the convoy prepared to leave the sanctuary, Albert realized that this experience had taught him something important about the bonds that sustained him through life's challenges. His relationship with Lightning was irreplaceable, but it was strengthened by the brotherhood of men who understood the value of loyalty and would travel any distance to defend it. The road home stretched ahead of them, and for the first time in 3 years, Albert and Lightning would travel it together. 3 months later, Albert stood in the same pasture where Helen had taken Lightning's photograph 5 years earlier. The autumn air carried the scent of hay and fallen leaves, and the mountains in the distance wore caps of early snow that promised winter's approach. Lightning grazed peacefully nearby, his black coat thick and glossy with health, his movements fluid and confident. The ranch had come alive again in ways Albert hadn't expected. Lightning's return had awakened something in the property itself, as if the land had been waiting for its most important resident to come home. The pastures seemed greener, the barn felt warmer, and the daily routines that had once been chores now felt like celebrations. "You're looking good, boy," Albert said as Lightning approached the fence where he stood with a halter and lead rope. "Ready for visitors?" Lightning nuzzled Albert's shoulder and allowed the halter to be slipped over. his head a gesture of trust that had taken weeks to fully restore. The psychological wounds from his captivity had healed gradually, requiring patience and consistency that Albert had been grateful to provide. A convoy of vehicles was making its way up the access road, kicking up dust clouds that signaled the arrival of Albert's teammates for their quarterly gathering. What had begun as a military reunion had evolved into something deeper, a family tradition that brought together the men who had proven that brotherhood transcended time and distance. Frank Bailey's truck led the procession, followed by Walter Hughes driving his restored 1970 Chevelle, Eugene Duncan in a massive pickup that suited his frame, Philip Curtis in a practical sedan loaded with communication equipment, Harold Harper in a security consultant's SUV, and Vernon Holland in a travel trailer that contained maps of every state west of the Mississippi. Albert led Lightning toward the barn as his friends parked near the house and began unloading their gear for the weekend gathering. These visits had become Lightning's favorite times, as if the horse understood that these men were responsible for bringing him home and deserved special attention. "Steele," Frank called out as he approached the barn. "How's our patient doing?" "See for yourself, Doc." Frank examined Lightning with professional thoroughness, checking his eyes, listening to his breathing, and assessing his overall condition with the expertise that had once saved lives in combat hospitals. "Remarkable recovery," Frank announced. "Weight restored, muscle tone excellent, psychological indicators all positive. This horse has healed completely." Walter joined them at the barn, carrying a camera bag and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose mission had been accomplished perfectly. Ghost documentation shows Lightning's return to optimal condition. Eugene approached with his toolbox, ready to address any maintenance issues around the ranch that might need attention. Tank inspection reveals infrastructure improvements since last visit. Someone's been busy. Albert smiled at his friend's observation. The ranch had indeed received significant attention over the past months, as Albert channeled his gratitude and renewed purpose into restoring every building and fence to perfect condition. Philip Curtis emerged from his sedan with an armload of communication equipment and a folder thick with official documents. Phoenix Intelligence brings updates from the fraud investigation. Good news? Excellent news. The FBI arrested 5 people involved in the horse theft scheme. Turns out they were selling the stolen Mustangs to overseas buyers for enormous profits. Harold Harper had been conducting his usual security assessment of the property, noting improvements and identifying potential vulnerabilities with professional habit. Razor analysis confirms the ranch security is now outstanding. New fencing, improved gate locks, motion sensor lighting. Vernon Holland consulted his GPS device and surveyed the property boundaries with navigator's precision. Viper mapping shows optimal defensive positioning for all access points. Albert appreciated his friend's professional observations, but their presence meant more than tactical assessments. These men had become his chosen family, the brothers who had proven their loyalty when bureaucracy and legal obstacles threatened to destroy what mattered most. Joyce Watson's car appeared at the end of the access road, followed by Ben Crawford's truck and Dr. Foster's veterinary vehicle. Albert had invited them to join the gathering as a way of thanking the people who had supported his fight to bring Lightning home. "Quite a crowd," Frank observed as the new arrivals parked near the house. "Good people deserve recognition," Albert replied. Joyce approached the group carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had chosen principle over profit. "Mr. Ward, how is our favorite Mustang? See for yourself." Lightning had been watching the arriving vehicles with alert interest, his ears forward and his posture relaxed. He approached Joyce without hesitation, allowing her to stroke his neck and examine the contentment that radiated from his entire being. "This is what success looks like," Joyce said softly. "A horse at peace with people who love him." Ben Crawford joined them, carrying a briefcase that contained documents Albert had requested for today's gathering. "Got those ownership papers you wanted, along with some other items that might interest you." "What kind of items?" Ben opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Property listings for ranches with horses that need homes. Thought you might be interested in expanding your rescue operation." Albert studied the listings, seeing properties and animals that faced situations similar to what he and Lightning had endured. The idea of helping other veterans and their horses had been growing in his mind since Lightning's rescue. Dr. Foster approached, carrying her medical bag and a portable computer for updating Lightning's health records. "Mr. Ward, I have a proposition for you." "I'm listening." "The sanctuary is establishing a program for rehabilitating horses that have been separated from their owners through legal complications. We need someone with experience in trauma recovery to lead the program." Albert looked at Lightning, who was now surrounded by admiring visitors and clearly enjoying the attention. The horse's transformation from despair to joy had been remarkable, but it had also demonstrated the healing power of reuniting animals with the people who loved them. What would that involve? Working with horses and owners who have been separated by bureaucratic problems, legal disputes, or financial difficulties, helping them reconnect and heal together. Frank Bailey had been listening to this conversation with growing interest. "Doc, that sounds like exactly the kind of work that would honor what we've accomplished here." Walter nodded in agreement. "Ghost operations proved that bureaucracy can be defeated when good people work together." Eugene cracked his knuckles thoughtfully. "Tank strategy suggests expanding the mission to help other veterans facing similar challenges." Philip Curtis was already making notes on his laptop. "Phoenix Communications can establish networks for veterans who need support recovering their animals." Harold Harper's security consultant background recognized the potential for systematic positive impact. Razor analysis indicates this program could prevent future separations through early intervention. Vernon Holland studied his maps, already plotting locations where such a program might be most needed. Viper Navigation identifies multiple regions where veteran animal separations are occurring. Albert looked around at his teammates, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through impossible missions 50 years ago. They were ready for a new mission, one that would extend the victory they had achieved with Lightning to other veterans facing similar challenges. "There's something else," Joyce Watson said, pulling an envelope from her purse. "The state of Montana has established a fund to compensate veterans whose animals were illegally seized. Lightning's case provided the precedent." Albert opened the envelope and stared at a check that represented more money than he had seen in years. "This is too much." "It's exactly right," Joyce replied. "Compensation for 3 years of illegal separation, plus damages for emotional distress, plus seed money for establishing your rescue program." Lightning had wandered back to Albert's side and was nuzzling his shoulder in the gesture that had become their signature greeting. The horse seemed to sense that important decisions were being made, decisions that would affect not just their future, but the futures of other horses and veterans who face similar challenges. "What do you think, boy?" Albert asked Lightning. "Ready to help other families stay together?" Lightning whinnied once, a sound of pure contentment that carried across the pasture like an affirmation. His eyes were bright with the intelligence and trust that had originally drawn Albert to him, and his posture radiated the confidence of an animal who knew he was loved and protected. Albert looked around at the gathering of friends who had traveled from across the country to celebrate Lightning's recovery and plan their next mission. These men had proven that brotherhood meant action, not just sentiment, and that some bonds were strong enough to overcome any obstacle. "All right then, Albert. said, stroking Lightning's neck as he spoke. "Let's help some more families come home." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the pasture where Lightning grazed peacefully, Albert understood that his journey had come full circle. The loss of Helen, the seizure of Lightning, and the bureaucratic battles that followed had all led to this moment. Surrounded by brothers who had proven their loyalty, holding legal victory in his hands, and planning a future dedicated to helping others avoid the pain he had endured. Lightning approached the fence one final time as darkness fell, pressing his muzzle against Albert's palm in the gesture that said everything words could not express. They were home, they were together, and they were ready to ensure that other veterans and their animals would never face separation alone. The ranch was quiet now, except for the sounds of friendship and planning that carried from the house, where 7 men discussed strategies for their next mission. Lightning stood guard in his pasture, alert and content, watching over the home that bureaucracy had tried to destroy, but brotherhood had restored. Some bonds are forged in combat, others in love, and the strongest are tempered by both. In the mountains of Montana, under stars that had witnessed 50 years of friendship, those bonds had proven once again that they were unbreakable. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.